So, Daredevil is one of my favorite shows of all time, at least top 3, so I just want to let you all know that this list was not easy in the slightest to compile. Quite frankly, I don't think there's a single bad episode in this series. I don't even think there's a single episode that's below a 7 out of 10 if I'm being honest. So what I'm trying to say is that every episode of Daredevil is amazing, and I think everyone's top 10 episodes of this show are all going to be equally valid because of that. So let me know your guys' list down below. And if you enjoyed today's video, please remember to leave a like and subscribe, and follow my social media to stay updated with my content. Alright, let's get into it. For some honorable mentions, I have Season 3, Episode 10, Karen. This episode was a long time coming, with Karen very vaguely referencing her past, her emotionally distant father, and more. It felt more like a sincere character study than a Daredevil episode for the most part, and that's a good thing. Season 3, Episode 4, Blindsided. The prison scene. That's it. Season 1, Episode 12, The Ones We Leave Behind. This scene has that infamous and dope parkour scene with Matt, some real pathos between Ben Urich and his dementia-ridden wife, and we get to see Matt finally show his vulnerable side as he emotionally breaks down in front of Karen. Oh, and also this scene between Ben Urich and Fisk literally had me on the edge of my seat. Season 3, Episode 12, One Last Shot. Here we get some really cool character depth with Agent Nadeem alongside this really creative action sequence where Matt is telling Nadeem exactly where to shoot through the van that they're in. And lastly, Season 1, Episode 10, Nelson v. Murdoch. This episode is phenomenal as it's very character focused and is only reliant on emotional stakes instead of doing something very action oriented. It's got amazing acting, charming flashbacks, and so much more. Okay, now it's time to get into the top 10. At number 10 I have Season 3, Episode 13, A New Napkin. The finale of Season 3 pretty much did everything I wanted, and more. Which is really a testament because a big chunk of this season's plotline was just to stop Fisk, which we already seen happen in Season 1, yet the writers find a way to get me even more invested in their struggle this time. A big part of this is mostly due to how the writers further develop the relationship between Wilson and Vanessa. All Fisk wants is to just have a happy life with her and get married. Sure, I mean he's done a lot of vile and twisted things in order to get it, and she's arguably just as evil as him, but let him be happy, right? But there's also this added pressure as Dex finds out that Fisk has been playing him this whole time and that Fisk was the one who orchestrated the death of Julie. There's tension coming from so many angles and it eventually culminates into this three-way fight in Fisk's penthouse. Here we get to visually see Dex as the long-range guy, Matt as the mid-range guy who is better at melee, and Fisk who has literally zero fighting technique and is just a big brute with a ton of anger residing in him. There's a lot of cool visual detail and the choreography is very well executed, with the most satisfying and iconic part being Matt unleashing this primal, animalistic, and freeing scream as he decides to not kill Fisk despite everything he's done. It was slightly teed up earlier in the season as Fisk recommended Dex to do this, so we get to see how alike all three of these guys really are in just this one scene. It's extremely satisfying yet tragic at the same time as Fisk takes a brutal beating in front of the Rabbit in a Snowstorm painting that led Fisk and Vanessa to fall in love with each other. His blood gets spewed on the painting, symbolizing how Fisk failed to be together with Vanessa, alongside their twisted relationship which seems to only lead to further bloodshed. This episode is phenomenal on every level, and again the reason it's ranked as low as it is simply because there's so many masterful episodes in this show, and I really hope we can get that Season 4. At number 9 I have Season 1, Episode 6, Condemned. The episode starts with Daredevil cornered into a position where a bunch of corrupt cops are about to arrest him and kill Vladimir, who's the only lead Matt has on Fisk. Unfortunately for Matt, Vladimir gets shot and is bleeding out, which adds even more of a sense of urgency to the situation, where Fisk's men and police are after him, and he has to save this really evil Russian guy to get the info on Fisk. After this, the tension and drama does not let up for the entire episode, as Matt is stuck in an abandoned warehouse where there's practically nothing around him that can save Vladimir. So he ends up using literal emergency flares to cauterize his wound, which then alerts the cops of his presence. We also get our first conversation between Fisk and Matt, and we can see how much of a thorn in each other's sides they are. Matt is obviously heavily concerning Fisk, as Fisk knows that Vladimir has some pretty crucial information on him. But we can see how smart Fisk is, and that his main ability is to sway the public eye and use his money, power, and influence to gain control of the situation. The episode culminates in this tunnel fight where Vladimir finally decides to help Daredevil and die in a more honorable way. I just love when writers are able to make these seemingly unredeemable, vile people into sympathetic characters who go through really complex arcs, and this episode did it perfectly. At number 8 I have Season 1, Episode 13, Daredevil. The episode starts out extremely somber as we mourn the death of Ben Urich. I loved Ben as a character, but the saddest moment is easily his dementia-ridden wife's reaction to his death. The poor woman has already lost everything in her life, and now she finds her husband was murdered and it was completely covered up. Throughout the season, Matt also goes through a brief crisis of whether or not he should kill Fisk, as he believes he's the living embodiment of the devil. Foggy convinces him to use the law to bring him down instead, and it works. Until it doesn't, of course. And Vincent D'Onofrio also delivers this really dramatic dialogue of his interpretation of the biblical story, The Good Samaritan, where he says that he always saw himself as the Samaritan, as in he saw himself as the type of guy to help out the traveler that's inexplicably bleeding out at the side of the road, and without question he helps the traveler simply because he loves the city and all the people in it so dearly. But he realizes that he's actually not the Good Samaritan, not the priest, nor the Levite. Rather, he's the ill intent that set the traveler on a path he shouldn't have ever been on. This is where Fisk fully embraces his evil side, for a lack of a better term, and I don't think they could have handled this realization in a better way. Matt then decides to use the vigilante side of things to bring him down, and one of the things I really respect about this show is that they actually use the comic book suit. I think we see in a lot of media, especially the Netflix stuff, but they're too scared to fully commit to stuff like that in fear that it'll be silly. And it's not. Even if it is a little silly, that's part of the charm to it, and I wish more superhero media would embrace that aspect. Anyway, the episode culminates with a small fight in the alleyway where Matt has finally taken him down. And it works really well, which is a clear showcase that we don't always need some fancy spectacle to come to a satisfying conclusion for our story, unlike a lot of modern Marvel movies. At number 7, I have Season 2, Episode 1, Bang. Some people may think I'm overrating this episode, and I completely get that, but the first reason I really admire this episode is how it completely subverts your expectations with how fast-paced it is. To elaborate, in Season 1 it took 6 episodes for Fisk and Matt to even have a conversation, and that was only over the phone. This episode jumps right into it, wasting absolutely zero time as Matt ends up confronting Punisher here for the first time. The episode feels like a completely fresh take on the series, whilst also feeling like a comfortable next step for our main characters. It's way more violent somehow, but it's completely necessary in order to convey the emotions of Frank Castle. The whole episode has this amazing crime noir element to it, with an amazing pace as each scene forwards the narrative whilst also giving an apt amount of breathing room for the viewers. The color grading, the framing, cinematography, and lighting is absolutely perfect and conveying the tone and atmosphere these 4 episodes are striving for. The writing also does a great job at giving all 3 of our main characters something to do that forwards the main plotline. Foggy is risking his life to get info, Karen is talking to their main witness, and Matt is scouring the city only to find some truly horrific things, such as men literally being hung from meat hooks while they're still alive. The episode ends with a great fight between Matt and Punisher, as Punisher ends up shooting Matt in the head, which segues very well into the next episode. At number 6, I have Season 1, Episode 9, Speak of the Devil. This episode opens with Matt bluntly asking Father Lambton,
"Do you believe in the devil, Father?"
which then leads to one of the most bone-chilling monologues in the show, where Father Lambton recites an anecdote of this time he was volunteering in Rwanda, where he was trying to help the village elder by the name of Gahiji. Here he tells Matt that the head of the militia ended up hacking him to pieces along his entire family in front of the village. In short, telling Matt that yes, he does believe the devil exists, just taking many different forms. There are a lot of instances where show don't tell is the case, but this isn't one of them. The monologue was extremely powerful and all the dialogue felt extremely natural, which added a sense of realism that made the scene even more horrifying. Essentially, all Matt was looking for was a reason to murder Fisk, to see if it's morally okay to take a man's life if the man is truly that despicable. Matt then visits Vanessa in hopes to get to know Fisk a little better so he can have better insight on how to kill him, and the two finally meet. Afterwards, Matt goes back to Father Lambton, where Father Lambton tells Matt that he didn't visit Fisk for insight on how to kill him, but rather he went for an excuse not to. This episode completely cemented Father Lambton as one of the best characters in the show in my opinion. He's faithful, pragmatic, and such a great father figure to Matt. I feel like a lot of the shows, like The Flash, can get a little cheesy with all the characters giving the main character a pep talk to save the day, but this show handles it phenomenally. So Matt decides that he isn't going to kill Fisk. Well, that was until one of their most wholesome and innocent clients by the name of Mrs. Cardenas was stabbed to death due to the likes of Fisk. This is where Matt drew the line and went to find Fisk with the full intent of killing him. He ends up fighting Nobu, which leads to one of the most evenly matched and intense fights in the series, where Nobu ends up getting lit on fire and burning to death. And surprise twist, Fisk wanted that to happen because Nobu was inconveniencing him. Yet again, he displays his massive intellect. Matt gets even more of a beating from Fisk, which leads Foggy to find Matt half dead in his apartment. This episode was completely masterful from start to finish, and it absolutely wowed me with every frame, every piece of somber score, acting, visuals, and real quick, does anybody else really miss the hard noir visuals from the first 2 seasons? No? Just me? Okay then. At number 5, I have Season 3, Episode 1. Resurrection. Okay, so this episode isn't nearly as thrilling or flashy as many of the previous episodes I mentioned, but that's kinda why I love it. I think a lot of people consider this to be one of the more boring episodes of the series, which I completely get, but the reason why I love it so much is because of how it utilizes the lasting consequences of a building being dropped on top of Matt. Normally, by the time a new season starts, this would be an extremely minor issue that would hardly be addressed. Spoilers real quick for Arrow Season 6, but at the end of Season 5, we see Lian Yu is completely blown up with everyone Oliver knows and loves on there. Yeah, we resolve the conflict in literally just one episode. Sure, there's a tiny bit of ramifications later on, but we mostly don't get to linger on that trauma or the consequences of that. Daredevil does not do what Arrow did, which really wowed me because Matt is already a pretty disabled superhero as he's blind and gets beat up half the time, but now he's crippled, spiritually wounded, half deaf, and has no friends. The episode perfectly lingers on both his crippled physical and spiritual state, but it's clear that it's not at all in a rush to get him to heal back to his peak form. I just really admire characters that continuously get beat down but keep getting back up, and I don't think there's an episode more indicative of this concept than this one. For example, even though Matt has already suffered immense physical and emotional trauma, the episode doesn't throw him a bone by having him beat this random low-tier boxer, and he ends up losing. So Matt decides to give it one more shot and fight a bunch of low-level thugs he'd normally be able to beat with one arm tied behind his back, but no, the writers don't even throw him a bone then. Matt still ends up losing to them and is still spiritually wounded as he's pretty much going there to commit suicide. When do you ever see stuff like that? Right, like hardly ever. It just seems like a lot of superhero and just media in general are in a huge hurry to get your protagonist back into perfect shape without lingering on the lasting consequences. Not to mention, I also really love the scene between Matt and Karen where they have a conversation about Matt being Daredevil. The addition of Matt's mother is also really great as she's got this really dry and sarcastic sense of humor. I also admire how the cinematography is very laid back, slow, and contemplative, which completely parallels Matt's state of mind. And the last 10 minutes are literally just dedicated to a character that we've never even seen before, and overall this episode was extremely bold in my opinion. At number 4, I have Season 3, Episode 6. The Devil You Know. The episode starts with a reunion between Matt and Karen, and it's a little sad seeing how emotionally distant they are with each other despite all they've been through the last couple of years. The main premise of the episode though is to track down a witness by the name of Jasper Evans so that he can testify against Fisk so they can put him back in jail, proving that the shanking incident was staged. Meanwhile, Fisk is playing bullseye as he knows he's on the edge of emotionally collapsing, which then leads to the absolute massacre at the news bulletin. It's easily one of the most frightening scenes in the show that masterfully builds tension with horrifying visuals and just silence. It's so good. I love when scenes are just dragged out in silence, as I find it far more effective than having some blaring and suspenseful score in the background. The main reason I think that works so well is because we have no emotional cues to tell us how to feel in the scene. We're just left there helpless to watch. Now that's pretty much all I have left to say about this, because I did kinda do a video essay on this, which you can check out in the description. And getting into the top 3, I have Season 2, Episode 3, New York's Finest. This episode is a straight up masterclass in dialogue, tension, acting, fight choreography, and cinematography. The episode opens with a series of beautiful shots of Matt being patched up by a nun in a flashback, which then leads to the present day where Matt is beaten and chained up by the Punisher on a rooftop. The overall premise of the episode is literally just these two having a strong back and forth on the philosophy and morality of killing people. And again, that might sound a little boring considering they're not fighting each other at all, just talking most of the time. But it's legitimately some of the most riveting stuff in the series, as each scene they have together continues to escalate. The dialogue starts out one-sided, as Matt is trying to get in Frank's head a bit more, but Frank isn't really engaging in the conversation. Then it naturally bleeds into several arguments of the two trying to figure each other out. Then there's more added tension of residents coming up to see what the noise is all about, and we're really unsure of whether or not Frank is some merciless guy prepared to kill innocents, or he's genuinely trying to do what he thinks is the right thing.
You're not that guy, right? You want to explain that to the orphans and the widows of the men you killed?
You ever doubt yourself, Frank?
Not even for a second.
Really? Really? You never think for 1 second, shit,
I just killed a human being. A human being who did a lot of stupid shit, maybe even evil, but had one small piece of goodness in him. And then you come along and that one tiny flicker of light gets snuffed out forever.
This is the perfect philosophy for Matt to hold at this point in his life. Right before this, he had just dealt with the nefarious Kingpin. He now believes that no one is completely evil, and that everyone deserves a chance to try to be good. Because who are we as humans to take that away from someone else? But Frank makes a good point because he permanently puts them down, which means they'll never be able to hurt anyone ever again.
Let me ask you this. What's that? What about hope? The people you murdered deserve another chance. What, to kill again, rape again? Is that what you want? No, Frank, to try again, Frank. To try.
Frank's rebuttal is that he murders people who he firmly believes will never do good in their lives. He kills people for the betterment of society so that they won't have a chance to murder or hurt other innocents. And neither of them are completely right, as Frank decides to play a little moral game with Matt. Frank straps a gun to Matt's arm with only one bullet in it, and he brings in a man named Grotto, who Matt has been trying to defend so hard as a lawyer. Now, Grotto's a pretty bad guy who's made a lot of mistakes, but Matt can see that there's some good in him, someone worth saving. However, Frank reveals that when Grotto was trying to skip town, an elderly lady who had a husband and kids saw his face. Due to this, Grotto ended up killing her, furthering Frank's point that had he killed him in the first place, none of that would have happened. Sure, it won't bring anyone back, but it'll prevent further people from dying. So Matt's options are that he can shoot Grotto himself, realizing Punisher is right, kill Frank himself in order to save Grotto, or do nothing at all and Frank will shoot Grotto. Either way, someone is going to die, and Matt can't do anything to stop it. The writing in this episode just leaves me awe-inspired. There's tension coming from every angle here, and it never lets up, leaving the viewer completely in the dark. Matt shoots the chain, freeing himself, but Grotto gets shot anyway, dying. Meanwhile, Frank has angered an entire motorcycle gang that are all coming up to kill him, with Frank essentially saying that the only way out of this alive is to kill them. Which then leads to one of the best fight scenes in the entire show, where Matt has to plow through all of these guys by hand fast enough to get to Frank, who is in an elevator going down. It's extremely well choreographed and is made to look like it's a win-one shot. The scene is very violent and you can feel every punch in the fight. And at the end, Matt ended up proving Frank wrong in that instance. He was able to get away without killing a single person. The way the show is able to visualize both sides of the morality of killing is absolutely insane. Both of them have valid reasons for doing what they do. Sometimes they can be ineffective and sometimes they can work. There's no answer to who's right, it's just only further insight into how we just have to stick by our fates. At number 2, I have Season 1, Episode 2. Cut Man. So fun fact, Drew Goddard, who's written things like The Martian, Lost, Cloverfield, and has actually created Daredevil, ended up writing this episode. And it's a pretty cool showcase of how we don't always need to see the action play out on screen. The end of Season 1 Episode 1 ends with Matt going after this Russian gang who kidnapped a little kid, and Episode 2 then starts with Matt in a dumpster. Man, my guy just really can't catch a break, huh? So instead of the episode being this action-heavy thing where Matt is tracking down a bad guys to find this little kid, it's about Matt having to trust other people and heal from his mistakes. Here we meet Rosario Dawson's Claire, who is probably one of the most underrated characters in this Netflix universe. She's really caring, smart, and I always loved every time she appeared on screen. Meanwhile, we get flashbacks of Matt and his father, Batlin Jack. We get to see how Matt grew up pretty poor in this apartment where his life was really hard for him. His dad didn't really get that much money and was barely able to pay rent.
Give me rent. You'll get your rent when you fix this damn door!
Meanwhile, Matt has to patch up his dad after boxing fights because he, I guess, can't afford healthcare. The scenes where he showcases his powers, like how he knows someone's coming to the door or is lying, is really cool and unique. Much of the drama is built off the dialogue and slow tension, as there are some Russian guys who are scouring the building for Matt. The episode is also really fun too, as we get to see Karen and Foggy form a bond together as they drunkenly roam the streets of New York, and it's really fun and simple character building. That's why the episode works as well as it does. It's very understated in what it's doing, the scenes are played out very slowly and are very character-centric. Matt and Claire end up interrogating this one Russian thug by piercing this nerve above his eye, which causes him to reveal the location of the little boy. And then we get one of the most iconic fight scenes in superhero media, where we get this amazing one take in a hallway where we get to see Matt fight with every breath he has to rescue this little boy. It being one take isn't just some flashy thing, it adds to the claustrophobia and tension as we get to see the fights take place in real time. We already know Matt has lost to these guys before, so we really don't know if he's going to win this fight. But the main reason why this is so impactful is due to the scene before it. Matt's father was tasked with throwing his boxing fight so everyone can make more money, but he was tired of his son not being proud of him and seeing him lose all the time. So his father finally won a boxing match, but the cost of it was his life. Matt was left without a father, and he still carries that feeling of hopelessness to that day. The scene is so well acted and framed where Matt is feeling the face of his deceased father, and it's so tragic. So we really feel for Matt when he's fighting till his last breath for this little boy because he knows how crucial it is for him to grow up with a dad. Then we get this cool little detail where Matt unmasks himself right before entering the room, just so he doesn't scare the kid. And then John Paisano's masterful score kicks in, leaving me completely stunned. This freaking episode, man. It's a perfect episode that shows the introspection of Matt's psyche as we get to clearly see why he puts his life on the line every night, so that nobody will have to grow up like he did, alone. And last but not least, at number 1 we have Season 2, Episode 4, Penny and Dime. Quite frankly, I don't think there are any words in the human dictionary that can do this episode justice. Penny and Dime is the longest episode in the series, coming in over a little an hour, and you really get why. The first 6 minutes or so are just about establishing our main antagonist, and we get a real sense of the brutality and violent tone for the next hour. We then get this beautiful eulogy by Father Lambton as our characters mourn the loss of Grotto. It's pretty sad as they're literally the only ones who are there, which shows that Grotto was pretty alone in his whole life. The episode before this really complements this scene because a big part of why Matt wants to save people is so that they have a chance to redeem themselves and have a life. So there being no one that cares about Grotto is even more tragic as he never got a chance at doing that since his life was prematurely taken away from him. The premise for this episode is that there's this Irish mob out to kill Frank, and Matt is trying to find him in order to prevent further bloodshed. The vibe of this episode easily feels the most like a bloody crime noir, where there are a plethora of scenes that make me feel so uncomfortable watching. Frank's torture scenes, for example, are very hard to watch as he continuously gets beaten to a pulp. They literally start drilling holes in his foot, and then they threaten to kill his dog. Here we get to see that although Frank is a stone cold killer, he's not heartless as he chooses to give up where the money is in exchange that they don't hurt the dog. But then it's revealed that this was his plan all along, as there was a bomb that went off where the money was located, and Frank starts killing all the Irish gangsters in the most brutal fashion. That is, until Matt shows up.
No killing. Altar boy.
After this, we get hands on the most emotional, story-driven monologues in the entire show. Matt and Frank go wait for the police as they sit down at a graveyard. The monologue goes on for roughly 7 to 8 minutes, where it's unveiled that the reason Punisher is doing all of this was because his family was brutally murdered inside his house. He recalls the time where he finally got back from the military to see his daughter, and he wanted to surprise her at school. And there's just these really cool specific details that give the monologue so much realism. For example, he recalls that when he walked into the classroom, they were doing yoga or something, not even learning. Like, I know I sound like such a Daredevil fanboy for praising a minor scene like that, but it really is just the small details like that that make you feel like these are real people. Because naturally in real life, we end up sharing really random specifics on our story that may not be important. And in movies and TV shows, we often only get what we need to be told in exposition or dialogue. Rarely does it feel as natural as this. The story then ends with Punisher recalling that his daughter wanted to read her a bedtime story called Penny and Dime. But at the time, all Frank wanted to do was rest because he was so tired, so he said no. But he then wakes up to his massacred family and he feels like a failed father, as if he couldn't even do a simple job like reading her a book. And now he'll never get a chance to do it again as his family has all been taken from him. It's so freaking tragic and well written. So sad and tragic that it even had our boy Daredevil crying.
The camera's on Daredevil and there's a tear coming down his face. And I remember thinking, I remember crying in that scene. I'm a male actor, so that crying doesn't come that easily to me. If I cried in a scene, I need it to be like a super close-up, everyone needs to know, you know what I mean? And then I remember, right at the beginning of the scene, I had to carry this motherfucker from the bottom. Dude, I thought you were crying, man. It's sweet. I was like, this fucking guy's I carried him up the hill 5 times in a row, and then I had to sit there and I was listening to his speech, and the sweat is pouring. And just from sheer luck, one of these droplets of sweat comes down the center of the mask, and then it appears from under the mask, and it looks like I'm crying. I swear to God, if I ever win an acting award, I wish they played that clip.
Oh, never mind, I guess. The cops then show up and Daredevil tells Mahoney to take the collar to show that the cops are capable of doing their jobs and that the vigilantes aren't the only ones keeping people safe. It's a pretty legit concern and I like how that story arc wrapped up. We then get this tremendous shot of Daredevil victoriously perked up on a ledge with a remixed version of the Daredevil score overtaking whilst mixed with the rain, and it sounds beautiful. And I love how this extremely gruesome, nasty, and violent story arc simply ends with Karen walking Matt home to his apartment and they kiss for the first time. It's just so wholesome, and the cinematography and score completely overtake the scene with striking, intimate, and sultry visuals that could come off as a little cheesy, but don't because the scene has been anticipated for quite a while. It feels earned and I loved it so much. This episode is a straight up masterpiece, which is a word that I don't like to use very much, so I really do mean that. The cinematography, lighting, the atmosphere, the acting, the writing, the directing, the color grading, the fight scenes, just chef's kiss. So that'll be it for my top 10 episodes of Daredevil. I'm sorry this video was incredibly long. I really only meant for this video to be like 10 to 15 minutes at most, but then I just got really caught up in writing my thoughts for these episodes. And I really want to try and experiment with some long form content for you guys, so if you enjoyed the video, please let me know if you want more content like this, or if you prefer the shorter videos. And let me know what you thought of my list. Do you agree, disagree? Either way, I'd love to know, and please share your list in the comments. With all that being said, if you guys enjoyed the video, please remember to leave a like and subscribe, and I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day. Peace.